June 24th, 1948. The telephone call came at 3:17 a.m., jarring President Harry Truman from a restless sleep. He had been dreaming about his haberdashery in Kansas City, the one that had failed in 1922, leaving him in debt for years. Even now, as President of the United States, commander of the most powerful nation on earth, those old anxieties sometimes crept into his dreams. "Mr. President," said the voice on the other end. It was Dean Acheson, the Undersecretary of State. "I'm sorry to wake you, but we have a crisis in Berlin. The Soviets have blocked all ground access to the city. No trains, no trucks, no barges. Nothing is getting through." Truman sat up, fully awake now. He reached for his glasses on the nightstand, his mind already racing through the implications. When did this start? About 6 hours ago. They're calling it technical difficulties with the roads and railways, but our people on the ground say it's a complete blockade. Soviet troops are manning checkpoints on all the routes. They're not letting anything through. What about our garrison in Berlin? How long can they hold out? There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, it's not just our garrison. There are 2.5 million German civilians in the western sectors of Berlin. They need food, fuel, medicine. Without supplies coming in, they'll start running out in a matter of weeks." Truman swung his legs out of bed, his feet finding his slippers. "I'll be in the Oval Office in 20 minutes. Get the Joint Chiefs on the phone and find out where Marshall is." Secretary Marshall is in Paris for the conference on European recovery, but he's already been briefed and is flying back. "Good." Truman hung up and sat for a moment in the darkness, feeling the weight of what was happening. Stalin had made his move. After 3 years of increasing tension, of diplomatic skirmishes and proxy conflicts, the Soviet dictator had finally drawn a line that could not be ignored. Berlin, the former capital of Nazi Germany, now divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. The city itself sat deep inside the Soviet zone of Germany, like an island of Western presence in a Soviet sea. And now Stalin was trying to starve that island into submission. Truman stood and began dressing. As he buttoned his shirt, he thought about a conversation he'd had with Winston Churchill 2 years earlier, after the former Prime Minister's famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. "Stalin respects strength and nothing else," Churchill had told him over bourbon and cigars. "If you show weakness, he'll push. If you push back, he'll calculate whether it's worth the risk. But you must never, ever let him think you'll retreat. Because if he thinks that, he'll keep pushing until there's nothing left to defend." Now, standing in his bedroom in the White House, Truman understood that Churchill had been right. This was the test. Stalin was pushing, and Truman had to decide whether to push back or retreat. He knew what retreating would mean. It would mean abandoning Berlin, abandoning 2.5 million Germans who had put their faith in Western protection, abandoning the principle that the West would stand firm against Soviet expansion. It would mean that Stalin could blockade any city, any country, any people he wanted, and the West would do nothing. But pushing back carried its own risks. Terrible risks, because Berlin was surrounded by Soviet forces. Any attempt to break the blockade by force would mean war. And war with the Soviet Union, just 3 years after the end of World War II, could mean nuclear war. Truman finished dressing and walked to the Oval Office. The early morning corridors of the White House were quiet, almost eerie. A few Secret Service agents nodded as he passed. In the Oval Office, lights were already burning and staff were assembling. Within an hour, the room was filled with his top advisors. Acheson representing the State Department until Marshall returned. James Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense. General Omar Bradley, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and several others. Maps of Berlin and Germany were spread across Truman's desk. Bradley was pointing to the various routes into the city, all of them now blocked by Soviet forces. "They've shut down everything, Mr. President. The Autobahn, the railways, the canals. They're claiming technical problems, maintenance issues, but it's obviously coordinated. They want us out of Berlin. Why now? Truman asked. What's changed? Acheson answered. The currency reform, sir. Last week we introduced the new Deutsche Mark in our zones of Germany, including West Berlin. It's part of the Marshall Plan, part of rebuilding the German economy. But Stalin sees it as a threat. He thinks we're trying to create a separate West German state that will be aligned with us. Aren't we? Forrestal asked. That's not the point, Acheson replied. The point is that Stalin is using the currency reform as an excuse to try to force us out of Berlin. If he can make our position there untenable, if he can starve the city until we have to leave, he wins. Berlin becomes entirely Soviet, and our credibility in Europe is destroyed. Truman walked to the window, looking out at the dawn breaking over Washington. What are our options? Bradley spoke up. Militarily, sir, we have 3 options. 1. We force our way through the blockade with an armed convoy. 2. We abandon Berlin and withdraw our forces. 3. We find some other way to supply the city. What about the first option, forcing our way through? Bradley's face was grim. Mr. President, if we send armed convoys, the Soviets will stop them. That means shooting. And if shooting starts between American and Soviet forces, we're at war. A war we're not prepared for. We have 10 divisions in Europe. The Soviets have 30. We have a few dozen atomic bombs. They're working on their own. A war now would be catastrophic. So you're recommending we abandon Berlin? I'm not recommending anything, sir. I'm laying out the military realities. Truman turned back to face the room. Gentlemen, let me be clear about something. We are not abandoning Berlin. I don't care what the military realities are. I don't care how many divisions the Soviets have. We are not going to let Stalin push us out of that city. Is that understood? The room was silent. Then Forrestal spoke. Mr. President, with respect, if we're not going to force our way through and we're not going to leave, what exactly are we going to do? Truman looked at the maps on his desk, at the city of Berlin surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. And then he saw it, the one route the Soviets hadn't blocked, the one route they couldn't block without an act of war even more blatant than the blockade. The air, he said quietly. We fly supplies in. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Bradley said, Sir, Berlin needs thousands of tons of supplies every day. Food, coal, medicine, everything. You're talking about flying in enough supplies to sustain 2.5 million people. That's never been done. I'm not sure it's even possible. But is it possible? Truman pressed. Not easy, not convenient, but possible. Bradley consulted with one of his aides, doing quick calculations. In theory, yes. We have transport aircraft. C-47s, C-54s. The British have planes too. If we could coordinate flights around the clock, if we could establish an efficient system, if the weather cooperates, if nothing goes wrong, maybe we could do it. Then that's what we're going to do, Truman said. We're going to supply Berlin by air. We're going to show Stalin that he can block the roads and the railways, but he can't block the sky, not without shooting down our planes. And if he shoots down our planes, that's an act of war, and the whole world will know who started it. Acheson looked worried. Mr. President, this is an enormous undertaking. It will cost millions of dollars. It will require resources we need elsewhere, and there's no guarantee it will work. What if we try and fail? What if the airlift can't supply enough food and coal? Then we'll have to leave Berlin anyway, and we'll look weak and incompetent. Truman walked back to his desk and sat down. He looked at each man in the room, his eyes hard behind his glasses. Gentlemen, I've been thinking about this moment ever since Stalin started pushing after the war. I've been thinking about what I would do when he finally pushed too far, and I'll tell you what I told myself. I'm not going to be the president who let Europe fall to communism because I was afraid to take a risk. He leaned forward. My whole life, people have underestimated me. They said I was too small to play baseball. They said I was too poor to succeed in business. They said I was too ordinary to be president. And you know what? They were wrong every time, not because I'm special, but because I don't quit. I don't back down, and I'm sure as hell not going to back down to Joseph Stalin. He stood up. We're going to supply Berlin by air. We're going to do it for as long as it takes, and we're going to show Stalin and the whole world that free people, when they stand together, cannot be intimidated. Now get to work. I want planes in the air within 24 hours. The meeting broke up with advisors rushing off to make phone calls, send cables, coordinate with the military. Truman sat alone in the Oval Office for a moment, the enormity of his decisions settling over him. He was committing the United States to an operation that had never been attempted before. He was betting American prestige on the ability of cargo planes and pilots to do the impossible, and he was risking war with the Soviet Union if anything went wrong. But he also knew, with absolute certainty, that he was right. Because if America backed down now, if they abandoned Berlin out of fear, Stalin would know that he could push anywhere, any time, and the West would retreat. And that would be the end of any hope for peace or freedom in Europe. Truman picked up the phone and asked the operator to connect him to General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Berlin. "Clay," the voice on the other end was tense, exhausted. "What are your orders, Mr. President?" "General," Truman said, "how much food do you have in Berlin right now?" "About 36 days' worth, sir. Maybe less if we have to feed refugees from the Soviet sector." "Then make it last for 45 days, because that's how long it's going to take us to get an airlift organized and running at full capacity. Can you do that?" There was a pause. "Sir, are you saying we're going to supply the entire city by air?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. We're going to fly in everything Berlin needs. Food, coal, medicine, everything. And we're going to keep flying until Stalin lifts the blockade." "Mr. President," Clay's voice was thick with emotion. "Sir, the people here, they're terrified. They think we're going to abandon them like we abandoned Eastern Europe. If you do this, if you really commit to an airlift, it will change everything. It will show them that we keep our promises." "Then tell them, General. Tell them that America doesn't abandon its friends. Tell them that we're coming. And tell them to hold on." Truman hung up and sat back in his chair. Through the window, he could see the Washington Monument rising in the morning light. He thought about George Washington, about Abraham Lincoln, about all the presidents who had faced their own moments of crisis and had to make decisions that would define their legacy. This was his moment, and he had made his choice. Over the next weeks and months, the Berlin airlift became one of the most remarkable operations in history. American and British planes flew around the clock, landing in Berlin every few minutes, bringing food and coal and supplies. At its peak, planes were landing every 90 seconds. Pilots flew in all weather, through fog and rain and snow. Some crashed and died, but they kept flying. The people of Berlin, who had been enemies just 3 years earlier, watched in amazement as their former adversaries moved heaven and earth to keep them alive. Children gathered at the end of the runways to watch the planes land. Pilots started dropping candy attached to little parachutes, earning the nickname Candy Bombers. And in Moscow, Stalin watched with growing frustration as his blockade failed to achieve its goal. He had expected the West to give up, to decide that Berlin wasn't worth the cost and effort. Instead, they had doubled down, had committed to an operation that was costing millions of dollars and demonstrating Western resolve to the entire world. On May 12, 1949, after 318 days, Stalin lifted the blockade. He never admitted defeat, never acknowledged that his strategy had failed. But the facts spoke for themselves. Berlin remained free, the West had stood firm, and the Soviet Union had been forced to back down. Truman received the news in the Oval Office. His advisors congratulated him, celebrated the victory, but Truman was quiet, reflective. "We won this round," he said. But this isn't over. Stalin will try again, somewhere else, some other way, and we'll have to stand firm again. This is going to be a long struggle, gentlemen. A Cold War, as Churchill called it, and we need to be prepared for it to last years, maybe decades. But we proved something, Mr. President, Acheson said. We proved that we won't back down. We proved that free people can stand together against tyranny. Truman nodded. Yes, we did, and that's worth something. That's worth a lot. Years later, when historians asked Truman about the Berlin airlift, about the moment when he decided to stand firm against Stalin's blockade, he would say, "It wasn't a hard decision." It was the only decision. You can't negotiate with a bully. You can't appease a dictator. You have to stand up to them, have to show them that you won't be pushed around. That's what we did in Berlin. And that's what we had to keep doing throughout the Cold War. What Truman said when Stalin blocked all roads into Berlin was, in essence, a statement of principle that would guide American foreign policy for the next 40 years. We are not abandoning Berlin. We are not going to let Stalin push us out of that city. We're going to supply Berlin by air for as long as it takes. We're going to show Stalin that free people, when they stand together, cannot be intimidated. He said it to his advisors in the Oval Office. He said it to General Clay in Berlin. He said it to the American people in radio addresses. And through his actions, through the commitment to the airlift, through the willingness to risk war rather than surrender to intimidation, he said it to Stalin. The Berlin airlift was more than a logistical triumph. It was a moral victory, a demonstration that the West would defend freedom even at great cost. It transformed the people of Berlin from defeated enemies to valued allies. It established the principle that America would stand by its commitments, and it showed Stalin that his strategy of expansion through intimidation had limits. In the operations room in the Kremlin, Stalin watched the airlift with cold fury. He had miscalculated. He had assumed that the West was weak, divided, unwilling to make sacrifices for distant cities and foreign peoples. He had been wrong. Truman is more stubborn than Roosevelt, he told Molotov one evening as they reviewed reports of the airlift's success. Roosevelt would have negotiated, would have looked for compromise. Truman just digs in and refuses to move. Is that a weakness or a strength? Molotov asked. Stalin was silent for a long moment. It's a strength, he admitted finally. A dangerous strength. It means we can't push them as far as I thought. It means this Cold War is going to be longer and harder than I expected. He stood and walked to the window looking out over Moscow. But we'll keep pushing. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Cuba, wherever we can. We'll keep testing them, keep probing for weakness, and someday maybe we'll find it. But in Berlin, on that day in May, 1949, when the blockade was lifted, the people knew who had won. They had been saved not by military force, but by determination, by ingenuity, by the willingness of free people to stand together against tyranny. And in the White House, Harry Truman, the haberdasher from Missouri, who had never expected to be president, who had been underestimated his entire life, allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. He had faced down Stalin. He had kept Berlin free, and he had established the principle that would sustain the West through 4 decades of Cold War. When freedom is threatened, America will stand firm, no matter the cost, no matter the risk. That was what Truman said when Stalin blocked all roads into Berlin, not just with his words, but with his actions, and it changed history.